I'm delighted to invite onto stage Mark Little to share his story and formally open FutureScope 2017.
Cheers, Michael.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And as you say, I'm extremely grateful to both Michael, to Dublin BIC, to John Phelan, for really helping me in some ways be what I am today. I'm very grateful to them. Also curse them as well, because if I had just failed and gone away, I'd be in a nice safe job now. But instead, I got the addiction, I got the bug, an endless life of risk and enterprise. So in some ways, I curse them for that. But I'm genuine honor to be here today to open this conference. I know within a few minutes, you guys are going to be, all of you today will be plunging into detail on all the stages with all the perspectives you're going to hear today. I just want to ask you to step back for a moment, to take the biggest, broadest possible picture of where we stand today, not just as people involved in enterprise, but I want to convince you that there has never been a better time to be alive on this planet than today. By every single important measure of human progress, we are better off. Anyone here born 1990 or afterwards? A couple of young people in the audience? Perhaps there we are in the front here. Since 1990, there was 37% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty in 1990. Today is less than 10%. Life expectancy since 1990 has increased by about an average 6 years per person. On every single measurement, from literacy to nutrition, and in Western countries as well, in crime, in violence, we are moving in the right direction at an exponential pace. But do you see people out celebrating? Do you see political movements out there telling us, more of the same, keep going? Nah, we don't. We see this.
The world is a mess. The world is as angry as it gets.
Now, in one way, on the first part, he's completely wrong. Donald Trump is wrong to say the world's a mess. Clearly, that's not the case. But the second part is what I want to focus on. Why is it that at a time when we're making such incredible progress, when there has never been a better time to be an innovator, to be an agent of change, are people so distrustful of that process of change? Why are people so dissatisfied? Now, I think if you look back in your history, you'll see this is not the first time this has happened. At moments of great communications revolutions, for example, the inventing of the printing press, these things did not lead to stability. They led to centuries, in that case, of war and violence. And today is no different. At a point of rapid change, people do not feel comfortable. They feel very insecure. Now, I say this is because somebody, and I think we're all this kind of tribe of people who are agents of change and advocates of change, people who scale change. We have to stop for a moment and understand that cognitive dissonance. We have to understand that the forces that got us here today, the assumptions that we make about change and how to scale change, we've got to stop for a moment and take a very close look at why they're not working for so many people in the world today. Now, I'm somebody since I was a kid, I've been obsessed with change. So I'm just going to tell you for a few minutes my own personal story, which I hope will illustrate some of the things and the challenges that I'm talking about. I started out in 1990. This is me, my first publicity shot. I was a journalist with RT. I haven't changed a bit, clearly. But, I mean, think about the revolutionary change that's happened in journalism since that photograph was taken. Even just look at the photograph. Look at the telephone man on the size of the computer. These are reel-to-reel tapes in the background, by the way, 1990. Now, since then, what I've watched as a journalist, I was lucky enough to be a foreign correspondent and tell stories around the world. But you had to go through me as a journalist to get to this audience, and my satellite dish, and my printing press, or my wireless transmitter. And what I started to see as a foreign correspondent was when I looked at stories like the Arab Spring. This is Cairo during the middle of the Arab Spring. I was seeing these images, defining images of this incredible moment of change. They weren't taken by journalists. Essentially what was happening was anybody with a smartphone and a connection to a social network was a journalist. Literally in the blink of an eye, historically. The revolution had happened in the means of production of news. You no longer needed to have a monopoly over these satellite dishes. All you needed was this to become a journalist. Everything changed in a moment. It was exhilarating because we could see much more authentic images. real-time, subversive images straight from the source. But it was scary as hell for journalists particularly, and anybody who cared about quality journalism. So just a few, I think about 2 blocks away, if you put it in American terms from here, I started a company called Storyful. This is what we did.
We are part of a golden age of journalism and storytelling. Everybody now is a storyteller. There's hundreds of hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute. But when everybody's telling a story, which stories are worth listening to?
Storyful is the first social media news agency in the world.
One of the big stories we've been covering today is Yemen. We found this pretty dramatic video. So what we want to do is go to Google Maps, establish the location. We find the building here, which matches exactly. And now we're going to attempt to get clearance for the content and provide it to our clients for use. Hi, my name is Joe Galvin. I'm a journalist.
So what we were doing Storyful, literally from that office around the corner, for all the biggest news organizations in the world, we were basically purifying this flood of information that was coming out of the social web. We were a B2B company. We thought we'd come up with the secret sauce. And in many ways, we made a really big change, I think, in the way people thought about journalism in the social age. But it wasn't big enough. I mean, since I set up Storyful in 2010, this flood has now become an absolute tsunami. And we are now in the stage of overflow where fake news, as we know, is defining this era. We know that at this stage, the flood, as I say, has become this overwhelming wave. The average American consumes 5 times more information today as they did back in 1996. And there's just no way that anybody can cope with that rise in information overload. And this, to be quite honest, I think, is a defining change for anybody that is in business that is touched by this change in communication, which I would argue is everybody. Because what it does, and this is Nate Silver, who's my favorite pollster in the United States, and they get a bad rep, but this guy is good, published a book called Signal and the Noise, worth checking out. And he says we face danger whenever the growth of information outpaces our ability to process it. Now what he's doing is pointing to changes in the human brain. I think economics is good to understand the current moment. Science is even better. Because what science tells us is when people are faced with either overwhelming information or not enough, they go back to what they call heuristics. These are the biases in our brain that allow us to make decisions in difficult circumstances. We trust a neighbor or a friend more than we do an expert. We believe things because they correspond to what we already believed. And this is what's happening now. This is why we're creating a system, I think, in relation to information overload that is frying our brains. And as a result, the moment that people need trusted sources, whether it's in journalism or in business or in politics, they're not turning to those trusted sources. They're turning to the social networks. We now have a situation where 44% of Americans now get their news from Facebook. Facebook is now by far, in historical terms, the largest news distribution platform in history, even if it won't call itself a media company. Now, that's frightening, not just because all of these people are moving away from journalism toward the social platforms. The advertisers are going as well. 89% of the growth in digital advertising last year went to the 2 big social platforms, leaving the rest to go to journalists and others who are trying to be the gatekeepers. And it's not just that advertising and viewers and users are going there. I would argue that there's a backlash emerging against a business model in which we all feel good because we're getting something for free, but we know, as this cliche goes, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And I think people are starting to grow aware that this advertising model, which now is increasingly a programmatic and automated system, is harvesting our attention. Data is being taken and harvested to essentially create a new system that works by algorithm. All information traveling through these social platforms is ranked and priced on the basis of emotion, not truth, not quality, emotion. So when you see that newsfeed coming at you from the social platform, everything within it, the cute furry cat video, the fake news story from Macedonia, and the quality piece of journalism is given to you at the same price. It's all ranked on emotion. And journalism has to be a source of outrage or sadness or happiness to compete in that scenario. So my argument is, and this is my area in journalism, is that if you had to build a business model to erode truth in quality news and information sources, you could not design a better model than the one we are now in, after this wave of 10 years of disruption. I would also argue it's not about journalism, just about journalism. If you take, for example, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which was released last year, it shows that for the first time there's been this radical implosion of trust across society. More than 2 out of 3 of all the countries surveyed by Edelman now, a majority of people do not trust business, government, NGOs to do what is right. So what we're seeing now is a collapse of trust, not just in information from journalists, but trust in the social capital that keeps us together as a consequence of all this rapid change. So the challenge is not just for journalism. The challenge, I think, for anybody who's building a new business model and scaling is this trust, this capacity for people to fear change. So where do we start? Let's go back to thinking about designing a business model from scratch. If we knew everything we know now that has happened over the 10 years previously, what would we do? Well, the first thing, we'd re-examine the concept of scale. We'd re-examine the veneration we put around the unicorn, and that success is having user bases that we can measure in billions and not millions. I would argue that if you think about the business model that is based on quantity and scale, and that's all it's about, it's exactly the wrong model, exactly the wrong objective on its own. And it used to be, I don't know if you remember a book a couple years back which described the first wave of this democratic awareness that came with the internet. Here comes everybody. Social theorist called Clay Shirky. He stole it from Finnegan's Wake, by the way. I would argue that may have defined the last 10 years and the assumptions we make about enterprise in the age of the social platform. Coming forward, we have to be thinking about, here comes somebody. We've got to stop thinking solely about building mass audience, mass reach, and start thinking about building deeper engagement with the individual, with somebody. And if you think about how that changes business models and our approach particularly to enterprise, I think it's quite revolutionary. I think, for example, going back to journalism, in the past 3 months, as people became much more aware of fake news and trust and truth, we've started to see quality journalism based on direct connection to the user. Forget advertising, direct subscriptions, really seeing what they call now a Trump bump, but I think it's actually something more substantial. The Economist, for example, subscriptions in the US up 19%. Just last 24 hours, the Wall Street Journal announced 300,000 extra subscribers. New York Times during the week, another 308,000 extra subscribers. They're building businesses where there's a direct connection to the consumer. Forget advertising. Forget necessarily about the millions and start thinking about the depth of the connection to the hundreds of thousands and deeply at the individual. So for me, that also opens up the whole concept of data, because so far, we've used data in a kind of a surreptitious way. We've seen the emergence of signals from the individual that we kind of harvest and manipulate their user behavior. We've seen, and I would say the bad part of it, we've seen a system that's all about what you like, what you already have bought. It's about likes and wants. And in this next stage of the internet, as data and artificial intelligence, machine learning becomes ever more sophisticated, we want to be thinking about what the individual does and what they need. I don't care about giving them endless videos of cute cats in the morning. I care about their commute, because that's much more important to them. That's where I think the new business models are. Again, not looking at scale, but looking at depth of connection. So again, I'm talking to you in some ways as a person who's had a journey that lets me give you some first-person testimony. I'll just give you a couple of minutes before I close about what I think the responsibility of the individuals in this room, myself included. I worked for Twitter. I've worked as a startup guy. I'm going back on the road again. I'm considering new ideas. I'm literally back at Square, year zero, thinking about this. And I've been thinking a lot about this photograph. This is my very first day as an entrepreneur. It was January 10th of 2010, just me. I think people may have heard me telling the story about my first day. I had a whiteboard and I had permanent marker. I ended up the first afternoon of my entrepreneur career rubbing permanent marker off a whiteboard. That's how inexperienced I was. I used that photograph to remind myself the journey that I took, because I started very small, and what defined my success, I realized in retrospect, was not the scale of my ambition, was not the fact that I wanted to be huge and global, But if I went back and I looked at that journey I took, it was about paying attention to every single small detail. Not revenue, but cash flow. Understanding the difference between the two, for example. There were 10,000 steps along the way, most of which went right or wrong depending on things like luck and awareness and attention to detail. First thing I remind myself, and I think that is ever so more important today. The second, again, as I look at this, and it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. Samuel Beckett in Wordsworth Ho, he says, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. If I could go back and remind my 2010 self what's important, it's not getting here to conferences like this and having someone get up and tell you how successful they were because of preordained brilliance on their part. It's about asking people to tell you about their worst failure, because that's where you learn. I learned nothing about my success. I learned everything from learning very quickly, not quickly enough, the process of agile, the concept of having a North Star and just getting a small bunch of people to constantly iterate and quickly learn, quickly fail, and stop doing it. It's a constant process which I learned and is fit for purpose today. I also learned about the myth of the charismatic founder. Even if you are a charismatic founder, that's not the basis of the success of your business. It's your ability to put together a team. In this case, this was my Storyful team. I've also led teams in Silicon Valley companies as well. And what I realized was my charisma as a founder was not the thing that was the magic sauce. It was my ability to maintain consistency when we were changing, maintain the trust of the people around me by being respectful, by respecting not just diversity, for example, as some sort of thing to be added on as we went on, but at the core. If you're a room full of men and you're in a startup company that's scaling, you're missing half the story. It's not just about a nice to have in terms of diversity and gender, it's an absolutely must have. And these are lessons you only learn in retrospect, and they are so relevant today. I also learned a lot about the concept of communication. I went into Twitter, and this was the cover I chose for my laptop, Communicate Fearlessly to Build Trust. It's one of the values of the company. And what I meant by that was I realized at 47 years old, I had succeeded partly because of survival instincts that I developed. I had never had a critical feedback loop as a journalist, as an entrepreneur. It was when I got to Twitter that I started learning the value of creating the ability to have people next to you that can give you constant critical feedback in this agile process. And it became for me a really good metaphor, and I'll end here for what I'm really trying to say today is that in many ways, when I look at the world around us, I realize that so many of the lessons that inspired sort of the last wave of entrepreneurs who came of age during the initial part of this social communications revolution are no longer fit for purpose and are potentially dangerous. I'm not saying we shouldn't set our sights on becoming global companies with reach and millions, if not billions of users. I'm not saying that. But if all you're focused on is the unicorn, you'll fail. If all you're focused on is just disruption, you'll fail. Do you think people want more disruption in journalism? No. They want builders. They want trust. They want people to look at those core elements. And do you think at the end of the day, people do want the kind of arrogance of certainty that we're right, that we know technology is always going to be a straight line? They don't. They want to know that the philosophy that inspired the great generations of innovators and pioneers that preceded us, they're not a straight line. We can't assume just because of the good intentions of Mark Zuckerberg or people like him that they are going to be fulfilled. So we have to go right back. And I think the first place to start is back to what I talked about earlier on, is this obsession with the user, the obsession with the individual. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not throwing away all the cliches that have inspired us. It's making sure we know which ones are fit for purpose. So first of all, you fall in love with the problem, not the solution. You fall in love with the user, not the product. Because in the end of the day, that's really what I'm trying to say here, is that we have so many things that we should continue to hold dear from what's created this great period of change. But it's all going to come down to two things: the need of the individual and your ability to fulfill that need. And in a world that is defined by only one thing, and that is change, when the only constant is rapid change, I would argue it's as simple and as complicated as that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you kindly, Mark. And Mark, we wish you the very, very best in your next chapter, no doubt entrepreneurial.